Smarter cities have long been considered the pathway to better and faster urban mobility solutions. Smart city development and better urban mobility overall can help reduce long-standing systemic disparities and create safer roadways. Our future cities need to be multimodal and draw together all forms of mobility. They need to enable the transition of our vehicles to electric and self-driving, and they need to ensure that the forms of transit and infrastructure being implemented is ultimately more efficient, more sustainable, and more equitable. As this is all happening, a lot else needs to align. Automakers and tech companies are a major part of this future, but the government also plays an important role. And much of this lies on consumers too. So joining me now to discuss the opportunities and future of our cities are Trevor Paul, Chief Mobility Officer for the state of Michigan, Oliver Cameron, Vice President of Product at General Motors Autonomous Electric Car Unit Cruise, and Xianpei Zhai, Uber's Director of Policy, Cities, and Transportation. Thank you all so much for being here today. Xianpei, I'd like to start with you. What really is a smart city? What makes a smart city? Are these still a topic of interest anymore? Tell me more.
Smart cities have been around. That term has been around for a really long time. But what it really speaks to, in my mind, is the ability to be flexible, to be adaptable, to be resilient, to help cities overcome challenges and respond to future need. And I also think it speaks to the need to center the people of the city and to use technology as a way of making that possible. What you spoke about was the integration of a lot of different stakeholders, outcomes, different systems. And what we want to try to do in smart cities is to use technology as a way of bringing that all together. Some of the ways I think about doing that is, perhaps during the pandemic, we really discovered that our assets, our public assets in cities have been underutilized. Parking spaces, for example, are typically underused, and we repurpose them. We open streets, we created parklets. There's outdoor dining all over in cities all over the world for once. And there was an ability to also accommodate that with changing transit lines, with pickup drop-off zones, with more delivery. And so you're starting to see how technology played a role in enabling the changes in the physical space to accommodate the ways people were moving around, also to make it possible to then consider future development in the way that the cities would evolve.
Absolutely. I'm hoping to build on that with some other perspectives. What exactly makes a city smart versus simply a city that's evolving for the future and getting better? Oliver, maybe we can start with you. Is this more so the idea of retrofitting existing cities?
I believe so. People own cars often because it's the most convenient option, not because it's the cheapest, the easiest, or perhaps the most reliable form of transportation. And, folks that live in cities, of course, prioritize getting from point A to B as reliably and time effectively as possible. And, when I think about making a city smart or being retrofitted to become better than it currently is, to me, of course, with our work at Cruise, a lot of that is about giving folks more options, giving folks more reliable options, giving folks safer options, cheaper options to get around their cities. And that's, something that I personally find really exciting about Cruise, where when we look at the options that currently exist within cities, there's really so much opportunity to improve just what it means to get around a city and to offer far more options, far more democratized access to safer transportation. So, when I think about smart cities, it conjures in people's heads these utopias that you think about, 20 years ago were held up as the cities of the future. I think much of what is, happening in cities is a little evolutionary. And that's okay. That's exciting, right? Because again, it gives folks more options and more access to things in their cities.
When I think smart cities, I don't necessarily think smart as in efficiency. And maybe that's just the role that I have in government. I think of it as like safety, a greener city, a city that upholds a person's dignity. And so a lot of times when I hear smart city, I start with the problems. Like right now, it's emissions, it's congestion. And so how can we leverage data platforms, 5G, to allow various city assets to talk with one another? Maybe it's as simple as having a streetlight talk to a set of safety glasses in a construction zone to make that particular intersection safer. smart city, I think a big misnomer with smart cities is that you just flip a switch and all of a sudden the entire city is smarter. The truth is it starts with intersections, it starts with sidewalks, it starts with use cases, it starts with individuals. And once you have the right data, you can begin to make better decisions about how you use your streets, how you use your buildings. And ultimately, that's going to lead to more options, transportation options, movement options for both people and goods in a city, which then, if you're using better data, better decisions, better operations, that's going to lead to affordability at the end of the day. So it's going to be a little cheaper to ride the bus, and then everyone wins, or whatever sort of micromobility option there is. There's a lot there. I mean, I love this topic. Alexa, you're the right person to be talking about it.
I appreciate that, Trevor. You touched on this a bit already, but I'd love to hear, Shinpei, from your perspective with Uber, how smarter cities can enable these effective and equitable urban transportation solutions. You mentioned earlier, too, there's so many different stakeholders. You come at this with a unique perspective.
I think there's such a unique opportunity right now to see what's going on, especially with the pandemic, all the ways that we've changed our behavior, changed travel patterns, but also to really recognize what was essential. At the same time, we've seen enormous inequities that have always existed became so much more visible. Recent analysis that we did at Uber showed that during the pandemic, there was very consistent use of ride hail from lower income neighborhoods in comparison to higher income neighborhoods. So while, all transportation dropped, there was a very steady sort of use and recovery of ride hail use in lower income neighborhoods. And many of those trips took people to essential jobs, to hospitals, to distribution centers, even to parks, because maybe, parks are on the outskirts of a city that they may not be so well served by transit. So what this said to us is that, technology can kind of fill gaps where there might be an enormous disruption, that it can overcome some, systemic barriers. Some of these lower income communities are a result of decades of policies that have created the situation where they are cut off from opportunities, cut off from ability to get to jobs, schools, medical care. And we see the use of technology here in helping to kind of give them some insurance. So let's say they do take the bus, they can rely on ride hail to make sure that they get to their job. But, and it's every so often, maybe it's not every single day, but there is a consistent use there that we thought was really interesting during this time.
Trevor, I want to go back to you for this one. You mentioned your role in government, and I'm curious about the challenges in terms of aligning political will, this technological development, and all of the necessary other industry stakeholders to make smart cities and more equitable urban mobility happen, really to work cohesively and bring together existing infrastructure.
It's a delicate dance. And I think the role of, for instance, my office, which is focused on future mobility, is to begin to draw through lines between effective policy and dynamic programming. A lot of times policies have a blanket effect. However, a policy may work better on one street or one part of town than it does on the other part of town. I mean, you marry that with technology that's moving at a speed that's much faster than the public sector and policymakers are moving. You have a situation where you have the technology to solve a problem. However, you don't necessarily have a set of rules that allows you to do that. For, I guess, our team, we wake up every morning thinking about how can we tell the story of, for instance, DSRC technology at an intersection, and how that extra split second of data that a sensor can provide you can be the difference between whether you make it out of a traffic accident or not. And I think that more that we can begin to humanize some of the engineering terms and begin to sort of introduce policymakers to industry more frequently, I think we'll be able to move a bit faster to set up laws and set up various procedures that speed up the ability to be smart. Now, the one thing I'll add, coming out of the pandemic, it was really cool in Detroit to see how quickly the city reacted to the restaurants only being able to serve takeout and changing ordinances overnight that allowed for delivery zones, pickup zones. And I'm hoping that sort of sets the standard going forward for governments to react.
Yeah, I was just thinking a lot about this partnership that you mentioned, Trevor, about working with agencies. I mean, it was really clear during the pandemic that public agencies could pivot And that for smart cities, it's not a matter of whether or not the technology exists. It's how it's applied, it's where it's applied, how it's tailored, how does it help support the resiliency that I think a lot of cities exhibited during the pandemic. One of the few ways that we did that at Uber was to work closely with transit agencies to provide first last mile service, to provide a guaranteed ride home because transit service was cut off late at night, or we continue to double down on transit investments. We connected walking with ride hail with transit journey planning, so you can get the whole door-to-door experience. We also saw a lot of cities, to that point about outdoor dining, just rethink their curves. And yes, there's more pickup drop-off. That isn't necessarily a technological innovation, but what it does do is provide then the additional space to increase the performance of the curb and rethink what retail might be, rethink what dining might be, and just rethink, the use of our streets, which is the biggest public space that we have in our cities. We have a team set up called the Mobility Solutions Team that works really closely with large institutions, large venues, and cities on thinking through these solutions and thinking through how do you maximize the multimodal aspect and phase out the application of technology so that you can reduce parking, increase the performance of your assets, and also think about that future state where, hopefully you come out of this pandemic and some of these things and innovations, the policy innovations and the space innovations and technological innovations stay in place.
Now, we've talked a lot about the accessibility piece, the role of government. Obviously, we mentioned sustainability earlier as well. And, in light of the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on the state of global climate, taking into account various weather disasters that we've experienced across the U.S., the shutting down of the New York City subway due to extreme weather, Tahoe being evacuated, countless examples. I'm curious how urban mobility solutions and smarter city infrastructure can help communities deal with these sorts of disasters. Oliver, can you talk about that and how Cruise might fit in?
Absolutely. The planet is telling us something, right? And it's important we listen and important that we act, because clearly things are headed in the absolute wrong direction. Cruise specifically, we get a lot of attention on our machine learning capabilities, robotics, and of course, self-driving cars. But a huge part of our mission is around sustainability. We strongly believe that every single autonomous vehicle should be an electric vehicle. If an autonomous vehicle is shared, it absolutely must be an electric vehicle. And in order to drive the fundamental change that we need to see for ultimately addressing climate change, one of the ways, and there's many ways, is that you can have a fully electric fleet of shared vehicles in cities. And our fleet, Cruise's fleet, is 100% fully electric and powered by from renewable sources. And talking about cities, it's my understanding that about 88 of the top 100 US cities have less than half of the necessary charging infrastructure necessary to handle electrification at scale today. And improving this situation is going to be critical to, again, accelerate the adoption of EVs and, again, further help prevent the crazy climate change that we're seeing today. So Cruise cares about sustainability, and the way we show that is action, because all of our AVs are fully electric. And by accelerating the change to shared electric transportation, hopefully we can make a dent in the climate change issue that's going on right now.
Now, I'm curious, what all your visions are for the future of urban mobility. There are a lot of solutions that need to be implemented, a lot of things that need to be aligned. Technology is there, and I imagine really complementary, diverse technologies, multimodal forms of transportation, of course, rather than any sort of mass displacement of one service in particular. Oliver, I'd love to start with you. What does your vision look like? Paint us a picture.
Absolutely. Well, it begins by clear collaboration, right? So collaboration between the AV companies or the transportation companies and the cities. And then really importantly, it's not just about that collaboration, although that is key. It's about collaboration with the residents of the city itself. If you are simply solving a problem for the city and not for its residents, then you're not really solving a problem at all. So Cruise specifically in San Francisco has invested a lot of time and energy in making sure what we're building is something that the city wants, and that we continuously listen to the city and its residents to make sure that we're building the right things at the right time. That said, when it comes to working with cities, one of the decisions we made early on is that we're not dependent on the city making modifications. We fully embrace the city as it is today, and we learn to handle all that the city has to throw at us. We're not dependent on new infrastructure. We're not dependent on 5G or any sort of new technology being installed within the city. We simply try and fit in with what the city currently has today. And it turns out it's a very hard problem. Of course, infrastructure can help make your life easier, but it comes at a cost. And driving in San Francisco is incredibly complex, specifically autonomously. We believe it's about 40 times the complexity of driving in suburban areas. And again, we're rising to that challenge and excited about it. But all of this comes down to, again, the basics. You work with the city, you work with the residents, and you fit in. You're not dependent on modifications or changes that, as we know, technology changes very fast and can be challenging for sure.
Trevor, from your point of view, what should the public really expect to see moving forward?
Vehicle electrification, more chargers, a more seamless charging experience, a demystifying of electric vehicle ownership. So that feeling you get, I know in Detroit, people don't want to necessarily buy electric vehicles right now because you can't drive them up north. There's not enough chargers. So making sure that as people leave cities, they feel comfortable leaving cities in their electric vehicles. As of 2017, I think emissions from transportation passed that of built infrastructure around the world. So if we can get electric vehicles right, or cleaner fuels right, I mean, that really does in some ways stop climate change in its tracks. Now, as it relates to autonomy, I think, the future is bright for cities, probably first in the way goods are moved around cities. In fact, just last week, we launched a new last mile robot delivery service in Yorktown neighborhood with KiwiBot that is like a little beer cooler with wheels that can deliver medicine and consumer goods and other things. Making sure that we can figure out those sorts of use cases will then, I think, pave the way for more passenger autonomy. But, for me, the future of the city is going to be safer. It's going to be a little quieter. You're going to have more information at your fingertips, more options to move around and see your friends and family and experience the city in new ways. Things look good. The future's bright. Even though we've been through a lot in the last year, the deployments that we're seeing across the U.S. and across the world give me hope that, 2030, we're going to see some of these big global problems be less because we've leveraged automated, connected, shared, and electric technologies.
That's fantastic. Shinpei, I'll give you the final word here.
One of the things we did during the pandemic was to double down on our vision of the future, which is a sustainable one, a resilient one. We made a commitment to be a zero emission platform by 2030 in the US and Canada and around the world globally. And this is the platform, our entire platform, all the different businesses on our platform. Both Trevor and Oliver said really resonate with me. And particularly the opportunity to overcome some of those inequities that we spoke about earlier, both the resilience to shock that we saw to climate events and extreme weather events. On-demand technology can help provide an immediate response, as we did in Cape May during Hurricane Ida, but also planning for the future, helping with the electrification transition. One of the things that we launched in 2019 was a clean air plan in London in response to the ultra low emission zone that the city had set up. But what it did was create a fund for drivers to help them get into electric vehicles. And as many people know who've been working on this, electrification marketing, a lot of the kind of resources are directed at households that are in the upper income brackets, not the lower income brackets. And we think that this next decade is all about figuring out how we can make all of these different kind of innovations for climate change, for resiliency, much, much more accessible to more people. And that's just really the final thought here is a smart city is a city for people. It's a human-centered city. And technology here is just the tool to make it happen. I'm really excited about all the ways that we can do that and the role that Uber plays in making that possible. I want to make sure that we understand that people are at the heart of it and how we get through this, all these emergencies and our long-term goals is really important.
I think that's a great final note to end on. I know we could all talk about this for hours, but I appreciate your thoughts in the minutes that we had. What we've really been hearing is that there's a vision of transportation moving forward that's certainly multimodal. It's not just cars or public transit or even shared mobility. It's really all of these forms working together. And the evolution of smart cities and urban mobility requires a variety of stakeholders. It's going to be the automakers and the tech companies, governments and the citizens all collaborating on this. And really the future of our cities and transportation systems, it's not just a boost to the economy, but it's critical for sustainability, making our cities greener, making our world greener, and equity, of course, making them far more accessible than they are today. But thank you so much, Trevor. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Shinpei, as well. Thank you all for being with us. I'm Alexa St. John again, and I know over the next several years, we'll certainly be covering this at Insider. But thanks all for watching. Have a great rest of your day.